My parents let my brother move into my apartment while I was abroad. Now they're mad I want him out, and I've been abroad for almost a year, traveling for work and a bit of adventure. I'd sublet my apartment to a friend while I was away, and I had the perfect plan to come back, settle in, and enjoy the peace of my own space again. After spending hours on a plane, all I wanted was to drop my bags, collapse on the couch, and maybe order some takeout. Instead, I walked into the twilight zone. The first sign something was off was the sneakers in the hallway. I don't own sneakers that big or that beat up. Then I saw the living room. My bookshelves were cluttered with stuff I didn't recognize. A gaming console I definitely didn't own was hooked up to my TV, and the coffee table was covered in half-empty soda cans and a plate of what I assume were nachos before they fossilized. "Yo, you're back." Mason's voice boomed from the kitchen, and my little brother came strolling out like he owned the place. "What's up? What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my cool. I was too jet-lagged to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Oh, yeah. Mom and Dad didn't tell you? I'm staying here for a bit. Just temporary, you know." "Temporary? No one told me this." I dropped my bags and glared at him. "You're joking, right? This is my apartment." Mason shrugged, as if it were no big deal. "Yeah, but you were gone for, like, ever. Mom and Dad said it'd be fine. I didn't think you'd care." My blood pressure skyrocketed. "You didn't think I'd care that you moved into my apartment without asking? How long is temporary?" He avoided my gaze, scratching the back of his neck. Not sure yet. I got laid off a while back, so, just till I figure things out." That's when the anger really hit me. Not only had he invaded my space, but apparently my parents had signed off on it like my opinion didn't matter. I pulled out my phone and called my mom. She picked up after a couple of rings. "Ryan, welcome home. Honey, how was the flight?" "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "did you know Mason's living in my apartment?" She hesitated. "Well, yes. We thought it would be fine. You were gone, and he needed somewhere to stay. It's just temporary." "No one asked me." I snapped. "Honey, don't be so dramatic. He's your brother. Families help each other." "Families help each other? When did that mean steamrolling boundaries?" I hung up before I said something I'd regret and turned back to Mason. "You need to leave. Today." He looked genuinely offended. "Dude, where am I supposed to go?" Not my problem, but Mason wasn't budging. Instead, he made himself a sandwich and plopped down on the couch like he owned the place. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't just drag him out, but I wasn't about to let this slide either. That night, as I lay in the bed I hadn't slept in for a year, I could hear Mason's video games blaring in the living room. It was surreal, and not in the welcome home way I'd envisioned. I couldn't believe my parents thought this was okay. Mason had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I'd spent most of my life cleaning up his messes, but this was a whole new level. The next morning, I confronted him again, hoping a night to think about it would make him see reason. "Seriously, Mason, when are you leaving?" He didn't even pause his game. "I don't know, man. Mom and Dad said you'd be cool with it." "I'm not." "Well, it's not like you need the space. You're barely ever here anyway," he shot back. The sheer audacity made my jaw drop. I spent the rest of the day alternating between calling my parents, trying to get Mason to listen, and venting to Ella, my girlfriend. She was sympathetic, but also practical. "Maybe he really doesn't have anywhere else to go," she said over the phone. "You should talk to your parents again and figure out a timeline." "A timeline?" I muttered. "He shouldn't be here at all." "Well, you can't just kick him out onto the street," she reasoned. I hated that she was right. As much as I wanted to throw his stuff out the window, I knew I couldn't. But every hour that passed made it clearer that Mason wasn't planning to leave anytime soon. By the end of the day, my frustration was boiling over. I called my dad, hoping he'd be more reasonable than my mom. "Ryan," he said in his usual no-nonsense tone, "he's your brother. He needs help, and I need my space. This is my apartment. Why didn't anyone ask me?" "Because you would have said no," he replied bluntly. I was speechless. They knew I'd say no, so they just did it anyway? I ended the call and paced the apartment, fuming. Mason had trashed my place, hijacked my life, and apparently my own parents didn't think I had a right to be angry about it. But the real kicker was that this wasn't just a mess I could clean up in a day. Mason wasn't going anywhere, and my family was siding with him. It was only the beginning, but I already knew this wasn't going to end well. The next few days were a whirlwind of tension, arguments, and passive-aggressive standoffs. Mason stayed glued to my couch like he'd been fused to it. My apartment, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a prison I shared with a disrespectful, freeloading cellmate. Every attempt I made to reason with him was met with indifference or some half-baked excuse. "I'm looking for jobs," he'd say, scrolling on his phone. Or, "I don't have anywhere else to go," as he sprawled across the couch, crumbs collecting in the cushions. I called Ella almost every night to vent. "This is insane. He's not even pretending to look for another place." She sighed. "I know it's frustrating, Ryan, but have you actually talked to your parents face to face? Maybe you need to make them understand how much this is affecting you." "They don't care. They've always babied him," I snapped, pacing the small kitchen. "Then show them you're serious. Get everyone in the same room and lay down some boundaries." She had a point. Phone calls weren't cutting it, and if I didn't take a stronger stand, this temporary arrangement could turn into something permanent. So, I bit the bullet and called my mom, asking for a family meeting. She sounded hesitant but agreed. We met at my parents' house a few nights later. The air was thick with tension as I walked in, greeted by my mom's nervous smile and my dad's stern, expectant expression. Mason, of course, was already there, slouching in a chair and scrolling on his phone like he had better things to do. "Ryan," my mom said, ushering me in, "why don't you sit down?" I made coffee. I didn't want coffee. I wanted answers. "We need to talk about Mason staying in my apartment." My dad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What's there to talk about? He's family. You're supposed to help each other out." I bristled at the word supposed. Help? He's taken over my space without asking, and he's not even trying to find another place. This isn't helping. It's enabling. Mason snorted. "Calm down, dude. It's not like I'm trashing the place." "Really? Have you seen the living room? You've turned it into a landfill." I shot back. "Ryan, that's enough." My mom interjected, her tone soothing but firm. "Mason's going through a tough time right now. He lost his job, and rent's expensive. We thought you'd understand." I might have understood if someone had bothered to ask me. I snapped. "Instead, you just decided it was fine for him to move in. Like my opinion doesn't matter." There was a long pause. My mom looked at my dad, who cleared his throat. "Ryan, you weren't even here. What were we supposed to do? Let him be homeless? He could have stayed here with you." I gestured around their perfectly spacious house. "Why didn't he move back home?" Mason finally put down his phone and spoke up. "Because I need to be in the city to find work." "Genius." I glared at him. "Do you even have a plan? A timeline? Or are you just planning to squat in my apartment forever?" "I'm figuring it out," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. "That's not good enough," I said, turning back to my parents. "If this is temporary, then I want a deadline. 2 weeks. That's more than enough time to find another arrangement." My mom looked stricken. "Ryan, be reasonable." "No, Mom. I've been reasonable my whole life. This is my apartment, and I'm done being walked over." She opened her mouth to respond, but my dad held up a hand. "Fine. 2 weeks," he said gruffly, surprising everyone in the room. Mason's head shot up. "What?" "You heard him," my dad said. "You've got 2 weeks to figure it out." I almost couldn't believe it. For once, my dad was on my side. Mason, however, looked like he'd been betrayed. "Unbelievable," he muttered, grabbing his phone and stomping out of the room. My mom sighed, rubbing her temples. "Ryan, was this really necessary?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm not the bad guy for wanting my space back." She didn't respond, and the silence was deafening. Part of me felt guilty. She clearly wanted to help Mason, but another part of me was relieved. For the first time in days, it felt like I had some control over the situation. The next morning, I got a text from Mason. "You didn't have to ambush me like that. Thanks for making me feel like crap, ***. I didn't reply. I wasn't interested in coddling him or getting into another argument. But later that day, something strange happened. Ella called me, her voice hesitant. Hey, I just got a weird DM from Mason. What? Why is he messaging you? He said he feels like he's being unfairly targeted and wanted me to talk to you. He said you're blowing things out of proportion. I groaned. Seriously? He's trying to turn you against me now? Well, I'm not siding with him, if that's what you're worried about, she said quickly. But maybe you should keep an eye on him. He seems off. Off how? I don't know. Just desperate. Be careful, okay? It wasn't like Ella to sound so uneasy, and it left me feeling on edge. Something about Mason's behavior wasn't adding up. He'd always been impulsive and immature, but this felt different. There was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite put my finger on, something darker. Later that evening, I ran into Grace, my neighbor, while taking out the trash. Grace was friendly enough, though a little nosy, and she seemed eager to chat. So, your brother's been staying with you, huh? She said casually. Yeah, I muttered, not really in the mood to explain. She tilted her head, her expression curious. He's been pretty busy. Lots of people coming and going. That caught my attention. What do you mean? Oh, just, he's had a few friends over. Late nights, loud music, that kind of thing. My stomach sank. When? A few times in the last couple of weeks. I figured you knew. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my cool. Not only had Mason taken over my apartment, but now he was treating it like a party pad while I was gone, and I had no idea who these friends were or what they were doing there. Thanks for letting me know, I said tightly before heading back upstairs. As soon as I walked through the door, I confronted Mason. What's this about you having people over? He blinked, feigning innocence. What are you talking about? Grace told me. Late nights, loud music. My neighbors shouldn't know more about what's happening in my apartment than I do. He scowled. So she's spying on me now? Great. Mason, I'm serious. What's going on? Nothing, he snapped. I had a couple of friends over. Big deal. It is a big deal. This is my home, not your hangout spot. If you pull this again, you're out before your 2 weeks are up. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off to the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, seething. I'd hoped the family meeting would be the turning point, but it was clear Mason wasn't taking anything seriously. The clock was ticking on his 2 weeks, and I had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to end smoothly. The days dragged on, each one more frustrating than the last. Mason had retreated into full-on sulking mode, barely speaking to me unless it was to complain about something. His 2-week deadline was looming, but there was no sign he was making any effort to leave. Every time I brought it up, he'd roll his eyes or say, I'm working on it. If working on it involved sitting on my couch and leveling up in some RPG, he was a star employee. But the real tipping point came when Grace knocked on my door one evening, her expression a mix of concern and hesitation. Ryan, I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, but, she trailed off, glancing over her shoulder. I saw your brother meeting up with some people in the parking lot. It looked sketchy. Sketchy how? I asked, my stomach tightening. She hesitated, then leaned in closer. I don't want to assume anything, but it looked like they were exchanging something. Money, maybe. I didn't get a good look, but it made me uneasy. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Grace wasn't one to stir up drama without cause, and the way she spoke left little doubt that she was genuinely worried. My gut told me this wasn't just another one of Mason's immature antics. Something more serious was going on. Thanks for letting me know, I said, my mind already racing. That night, I decided to do a little digging. After Mason went to bed, I quietly checked the spare room where he'd dumped his stuff. Most of it was just clothes and random junk, but buried under a pile of hoodies, I found a locked metal box. It was small but heavy, and the fact that it was locked only made me more suspicious. I stared at it, torn. Part of me felt like opening it would be crossing a line, but another part of me, the part that was sick of Mason's lies, knew I had to find out what he was hiding. After some quick Googling, I managed to jimmy the lock open with a paperclip. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The box was filled with cash, stacks of it, rolled up and bound with rubber bands. There must have been thousands of dollars in there. Beneath the cash was a small plastic baggie containing what looked like pills. My hands shook as I stared at the contents, trying to make sense of it. Was Mason dealing drugs? Is that what he'd been doing while I was gone? I quickly put everything back, locked the box, and shoved it back where I'd found it. My mind was spinning. This wasn't just about him freeloading anymore. If Mason was involved in something illegal, it could blow back on me, especially since he was using my apartment as his base of operations. The next morning, I confronted him. "We need to talk," I said, cornering him in the kitchen. He glanced up from his cereal, clearly uninterested. "About what?" "About the box in your room." His spoon froze midair. "What box?" "You know what box. The one with the cash and pills." His face went pale, and for a moment, he looked genuinely panicked. But then he scowled, his usual bravado kicking in. "You went through my stuff? That's messed up, man." "What's messed up is you bringing drugs into my apartment." I snapped. "Do you have any idea how much trouble I could get in if someone found that here?" "It's not what you think," he said quickly, but his tone lacked conviction. "Then explain it," I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're dealing." "I'm not dealing," he said, his voice rising. "I'm just holding on to it for a friend." I let out a bitter laugh. "Do you even hear how stupid that sounds? Who's the friend? And why would they trust you with thousands of dollars in drugs?" He didn't answer, just stared at the floor like a guilty kid caught stealing from the cookie jar. "That's what I thought," I said, my voice cold. "You have until the end of the week to get out, Mason. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here another minute. Ryan, come on." "No, we're done." I called Ella that night and told her everything. She was horrified but not entirely surprised. "Mason's always been reckless," she said. "But this is next level. What am I supposed to do?" I asked, pacing the living room. "If he's mixed up in something illegal, it could drag me down too. Maybe you need to talk to someone. Like the police," she said hesitantly. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "I can't. He's still my brother. As much as I want him out of my life, I don't want to ruin it." "Then you need to set boundaries and stick to them," she said. "No more second chances." She was right, of course. Mason had crossed too many lines, and I couldn't keep enabling him. But part of me still felt torn. He was family, and as much as I hated what he'd done, I didn't want to give up on him completely. A few days later, things took another unexpected turn. I was sitting in the living room when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Harper, Mason's ex-girlfriend, standing there with an expression that could only be described as equal parts angry and desperate. "We need to talk," she said, brushing past me into the apartment. I blinked, stunned. "Harper, what are you doing here?" "I've been trying to get a hold of Mason, but he's been ignoring me," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you know what he's gotten himself into?" "Why don't you tell me?" I said, crossing my arms. She hesitated, then sighed. "He owes a lot of money to some very bad people. That's probably why he's been acting so shady. If he doesn't pay them back soon, they're going to come after him, and anyone close to him." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean, anyone close to him?" She gave me a pointed look. "I mean you. They know he's staying here, Ryan. If they can't get to him, they'll come after you instead." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about Mason's irresponsibility anymore. This was dangerous. And suddenly, I realized just how much was at stake. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice tight. "Because despite everything, I don't want to see anyone get hurt," she said. "Mason may be a screw-up, but he's not a bad person. He's just in over his head." "Yeah, well, he's dragging me under with him," I muttered. "Then you need to do something about it," she said, her tone serious. "Because if you don't, this isn't going to end well, for either of you." As she left, her words echoed in my mind. I knew she was right. Something had to change. But how far was I willing to go to protect myself and my brother? The hours after Harper's visit were a blur of panic and anger. I'd thought things with Mason were bad before, but now it felt like I was living in the middle of a ticking time bomb. If what Harper said was true, and I had no reason to doubt her, I was in danger just by having Mason under my roof. My frustration at his freeloading paled in comparison to the fear gnawing at my gut. When Mason came back that evening, I didn't waste any time. As soon as he stepped through the door, I cornered him. "We need to talk. Now." He froze, his eyes darting to my face. "What's your problem this time?" "My problem? My problem is that your ex just showed up at my door to warn me that you've pissed off some very dangerous people." His expression darkened, and for a second, I thought he might deny it. But instead, he sighed and dropped his bag onto the floor. "Harper shouldn't have gotten involved. She shouldn't have had to." I snapped. "What the hell are you doing, Mason? Do you even realize the position you've put me in?" "It's not as bad as she's making it sound," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. "Not as bad," I repeated, incredulous. "She said they'll come after me if you don't pay them back. What part of that isn't bad?" He ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "I'm handling it, okay? I just need more time." "You don't have time," I said, my voice rising. "You're out of here by the end of the week, and that's final. If you're not gone, I'll call the police." His head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You'd really call the cops on your own brother?" "If it means protecting myself, yes," I said without hesitation. "You've crossed every line, Mason. I'm done cleaning up your messes." For a moment, he just stared at me, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. Then he grabbed his bag and stormed into the spare room, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, shaking, unsure if I'd made things better or worse. The next day, I called Ella to update her. "He's still not taking this seriously," I said, pacing the living room. "I gave him until the end of the week, but I don't know if he'll actually leave." "You've done the right thing," she said firmly. "You can't let him drag you into his problems. If he won't leave, you'll have to follow through." "I know," I muttered. "I just didn't think it would come to this." There was a pause before she spoke again. "Ryan, there's something else you should know. I heard from Noah last night. He ran into Mason downtown and saw him talking to some sketchy-looking guys." My stomach sank. "What do you mean, sketchy?" "Like the kind of people you don't want to owe money to," she said. "Noah said it looked tense, like they were arguing." I groaned, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Great. Just what I needed to hear." "Be careful, okay?" she said. "If these guys know where you live, you need to protect yourself." "I will," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure how. That evening, I decided to confront Mason one last time. If he wasn't gone by the end of the week, I'd have no choice but to involve the authorities. I knocked on his door and waited, but there was no answer. "Mason," I called. "Open up." Still nothing. Frowning, I pushed the door open and found the room empty. His bag was gone, and so were most of his clothes. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd finally come to his senses and left on his own. But then I noticed the small pile of envelopes on the desk, each one addressed to him. One of them had been opened, the contents spread out in plain view. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer to look. What I saw made my heart sink. The envelope contained a handwritten note, short and to the point. "Your time's up. Pay what you owe, or we'll make you pay another way, asterisk asterisk." Beneath it was a photo of my apartment building. My knees went weak as the full weight of the situation hit me. They weren't just coming after Mason. They were coming here. My hands shook as I put the note back and backed out of the room. I needed a plan, and fast. I called Ella again, my voice trembling. "They know where I live." I found a photo of my building and Mason's stuff. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Ryan, you need to get out of there." "I can't just leave," I said. "This is my home." "But it's not safe. What if they show up?" Her fear was contagious, and I found myself pacing again, my mind racing. Maybe I should call the police. "Do it," she said immediately. "This isn't just about Mason anymore. This is about your safety." I hesitated, torn. Calling the police felt like a nuclear option, but what choice did I have? If these people came looking for Mason, they wouldn't care that I had nothing to do with his mess. Before I could decide, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, staring at the door like it might explode. "Ryan," Ella said, her voice faint over the phone. "What's happening?" "There's someone at the door," I whispered, moving slowly toward it. Peering through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize standing on the other side. He looked rough, shaved head, tattoos, and a scowl that could curdle milk. I backed away, my pulse hammering. I think it's one of them. Don't open it, Ella hissed. Call the police. But before I could grab my phone, the man knocked again, harder this time. Hey, Mason, he barked. I know you're in there. Open up. I held my breath, hoping he'd go away, but instead, he tried the doorknob. When it didn't budge, he cursed under his breath and started pounding on the door. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, my hands shaking. He thinks Mason's here. I whispered into the phone. Ryan, you need to call the cops. Now, Ella said. But just as I reached for my phone, the pounding stopped. I listened, my heart racing, as the man muttered something to himself and walked away. I waited until I was sure he was gone before finally exhaling. That was too close, Ella said, her voice shaking. Promise me you'll call the police. I will, I said, though the thought of doing so still felt like admitting defeat. The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. Mason was nowhere to be found, and I had no way of knowing if he'd even come back. Part of me hoped he wouldn't. At least then, I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But as I sat there in the dark, clutching my phone like a lifeline, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Mason had dragged me into his mess, and now I had to find a way out before it was too late. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly. Still groggy from a night of tossing and turning, I grabbed it and saw a string of texts from Mason. Mason, we need to talk. Mason, I messed up. Mason, please don't call the cops. I'll explain everything. Mason, meet me at Dad's house. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. After everything he'd put me through, now he wanted to talk? Part of me wanted to ignore him completely, but another part, the part that couldn't stand unfinished business, felt like I needed answers. When I arrived at my parents' house, Mason was already there, pacing the living room like a caged animal. My mom sat on the couch, wringing her hands, while my dad stood off to the side, arms crossed and a stern expression on his face. The tension in the room was palpable. What's this about? I asked, my voice cold as I stepped inside. Mason looked up, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, he seemed genuinely rattled. I need your help, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I laughed bitterly. Help? After everything you've done, you've got the nerve to ask me for help. Ryan, please, my mom said, her tone pleading. He's scared. Good, I snapped. He should be. Ryan, that's enough, my dad barked, his voice firm. Let him talk. I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall, glaring at Mason. Fine. Talk. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling. I owe these guys money. More money than I thought I'd ever have to pay back. It started small, you know? A few bets here and there. But then I kept losing, and I started borrowing to cover it. Before I knew it, I was in over my head. How much do you owe? I asked, my voice flat. 20 grand, he said, his voice barely audible. The room went silent. My mom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. My dad's face darkened, and I could practically feel the rage rolling off him. 20 grand, I repeated, shaking my head. And you thought the best way to deal with it was to hide out in my apartment and drag me into your mess? I didn't mean for it to go this far, Mason said, his voice cracking. I thought I could figure it out before it got bad, but now they're threatening me. They said if I don't pay up, they'll come after me, and anyone close to me. You mean me, I said bitterly. They already showed up at my apartment, Mason. Do you have any idea what that was like? I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I never wanted you to get involved. Then why didn't you leave when I told you to? I snapped. You've had weeks to figure this out, and instead, you've been sitting on my couch playing video games like none of this matters, because I didn't know what else to do, he shouted, his voice desperate. I'm scared, Ryan. I don't know how to fix this. You don't fix this by dragging your family down with you, my dad said, his voice sharp. You fix it by owning up to your mistakes and facing the consequences. Mason looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. Dad, they're not the kind of people you just face. They'll kill me. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. As much as I hated what Mason had done, the thought of him being in real danger made my stomach churn. But I wasn't about to let him keep putting me, and my life, at risk. Then you need to leave, I said firmly. Get out of the city. Go somewhere they can't find you. I can't just run, he said. They'll track me down. Then what do you want from me, Mason? I demanded. You're the one who got yourself into this. I'm not risking my safety to bail you out. He opened his mouth to respond, but my dad cut him off. Ryan's right. You need to figure this out on your own. We've done enough to help you, Mason, and all you've done is make things worse. Mason's shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the floor, defeated. For the first time, he seemed to realize just how badly he'd screwed up. That night, I returned to my apartment, my nerves still on edge. Mason had promised to pack his things and leave by the end of the week, but I wasn't holding my breath. Every time he said he'd do something, he found a way to weasel out of it. Still, the thought of finally having my space back gave me a sliver of hope. But that hope was short-lived. Around midnight, I was woken up by a loud crash outside my door. My heart racing, I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, peering through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. 2 men stood outside, one of them pounding on the door while the other held a baseball bat. Mason, the first one shouted. We know you're in there. Open up, or we're coming in. I backed away, my hands shaking. Mason wasn't even here, but they didn't know that. And if they broke in, I'd be the one they'd take their anger out on. I quickly dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity as the men outside continued to yell and bang on the door. Come on, Mason, one of them shouted. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The men must have heard it too because they cursed under their breath and bolted. I stayed on the phone with the dispatcher until the police arrived, my hands still shaking as I let them in. After explaining everything to the officers, they assured me they'd patrol the area and keep an eye out for the men. But even after they left, I couldn't shake the fear that they'd come back. The next morning, I called my landlord and explained the situation. To my surprise, he was understanding and agreed to let me break my lease early. I spent the rest of the day packing up my things, determined to leave the apartment and all the chaos Mason had brought with him behind. Ella came over to help, her presence a comforting reminder that not everyone in my life was a source of stress. You're doing the right thing, she said as we loaded boxes into my car. You deserve to feel safe. I just wish it didn't have to end like this, I said, glancing back at the building that had once felt like home. It's not your fault, she said firmly. Mason made his choices, and now he has to deal with the consequences. As I drove away, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Relief, sadness, and anger all rolled into one. I didn't know what the future held for Mason, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done letting him dictate my life. It was time to move forward and reclaim my space, both literally and figuratively.